May 1945, the war's dying months. In a bamboo hut somewhere in the Philippines, a young Korean woman named Kim Sunhi, 27, crouches in the shadows. For 3 years, she's learned to read danger by sound, the rhythm of boots, the sharpness of orders barked in Japanese. Every noise outside the hut has meant one thing: pain. But this time, the boots sound different, heavier, slower. Voices murmur in a language she doesn't recognize. English. She clutches the edge of her torn blanket, trembling. The door creaks open. Sunlight floods the room. A tall soldier steps inside, his uniform strange, his face unfamiliar. He lowers his rifle. "Ma'am, we're Americans. You're safe now." For a moment, she doesn't understand. The words carry no meaning. Safe? The word hasn't existed for her in years. The soldier reaches out a hand, and she flinches, covering her head. Even kindness sounds like a command. Around her, other women emerge, fragile, thin, their eyes hollow. The soldiers look stunned. These aren't enemy combatants. They're civilians, barely alive. One medic whispers, "Dear God, what did they do to them?" The scene is chaos in silence. American troops trying to help, women too afraid to believe. One young private kneels and offers a canteen. Kim stares at the water, but doesn't move. He unscrews the cap, takes a sip himself, and hands it back. Only then does she reach out. When the first drop touches her lips, she starts to cry, not from joy, but disbelief. Outside, the wind carries the distant sound of retreating gunfire. Inside, something else begins, the slow, uncertain return of humanity. For Kim Sunhi, liberation doesn't feel like victory. It feels like confusion, like waking from a nightmare and realizing the dream hasn't ended yet. In that fragile moment, surrounded by strangers speaking a language she doesn't know, she whispers the only word she remembers from before the war: Umma. Long before Kim Sunhi's rescue, an entire machinery of exploitation had already been perfected. The Japanese Imperial Army called it the Comfort Station System, a name so deceptively calm it masked the horror beneath. It began in 1932, spreading across Asia like a shadow. Women from Korea, China, the Philippines, and beyond were deceived with promises of factory work or nursing jobs. Instead, they were transported to remote outposts, stripped of identity, and forced into servitude. Every comfort station followed the same design: a narrow row of rooms, a single guarded entrance, and silence thick enough to crush hope. The soldiers came in shifts. The women were reduced to numbers on a ledger. Every routine, when to wake, when to eat, when to breathe, dictated by men who believed obedience could be manufactured. Kim Sunhi had once been a school teacher's daughter in Busan. She remembered rain on tiled roofs, her mother's cooking, her father's worn books. Those memories kept her alive until even they began to fade. In the camps, time dissolved. The days blurred into each other, marked only by footsteps outside the door. The women stopped counting them. They stopped counting anything. By 1944, the system had become institutional. Organized cruelty dressed in bureaucracy. The comfort stations followed military routes, appearing wherever troops marched. They were considered logistical necessities, as critical as ammunition or fuel. Official documents referred to the women as special supplies. The euphemism wasn't just a cover, it was strategy. The less human they sounded on paper, the easier they were to control. Survivors later spoke of how their captors destroyed not just their freedom, but their concept of being human. They were told no one would ever come for them, that they were abandoned, forgotten, that their only way out was death. Fear became a language, and silence became survival. When the war began to collapse in 1945, the women heard rumors, whispers of defeat, of retreat, but they didn't dare hope. Hope was dangerous. Hope got you punished. And so even when the sound of American boots approached, Kim Sunhi did what she had been trained to do. She hid. because after years inside a system built to erase her, she no longer knew the difference between danger and salvation. April 1945, Luzon, Philippines. The 32nd Infantry Division advanced through the jungle, clearing out the last Japanese resistance. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hayes had seen many kinds of horror in this war, bombed villages, mass graves, but nothing like what waited beyond a rusted fence deep in the valley. The soldiers moved carefully, rifles raised. The compound looked abandoned. Bamboo huts, a few scorched flags, silence. Then, from one of the shacks, came a faint sound, a whimper. Private Daniel Martinez signaled, pushed the door open, and froze. Inside, a dozen young women huddled in the shadows. Korean, Chinese, Filipina, barely clothed, trembling, their eyes wide with terror. When the Americans entered, the women dropped to their knees and pressed their foreheads to the ground. They thought they were about to die. Martinez tried to speak gently. "It's okay. We're here to help." But his voice only made them flinch. Every man's voice had meant pain. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes lowered his weapon and knelt. "No more fighting," he said quietly. "You're safe." The words fell into the air like stones into water, ripples of disbelief. One woman lifted her head slightly, eyes darting from face to face, searching for deceit. When she saw the red cross patch on a medic's arm, she began to sob. The soldiers radioed for medical support. Captain Helen Morrison, one of the few female army nurses in the area, arrived within the hour. She described what she saw later in her report. They weren't prisoners. They were ghosts, breathing, but hollow. They recoiled from light, from touch, from kindness. The youngest looked barely 16. Food was brought, blankets distributed, but when medics tried to help, most of the women refused to move or speak. They sat in silence, staring at the floor. Kim Sunhi was among them, her hands trembling, her lips moving soundlessly, as if repeating a prayer. The soldiers who found them would never forget that day. Martinez later said in an interview, "They didn't cheer when we told them the war was ending. They just stared, like freedom was another trick." It was the cruelest truth of all, that liberation didn't erase fear. It only revealed how deep it ran. That night, as campfires flickered outside the compound, Hayes wrote one sentence in his notebook: "We found survivors who don't know they've been saved." The compound became a makeshift hospital overnight. The Army's medics were trained for battlefield wounds, bullets, shrapnel, burns, but not for what they saw here. These women bore invisible injuries that no morphine could dull. Captain Helen Morrison, a nurse from Ohio, took charge of the care effort. When she first entered the hut, she found women who weighed less than 80 pounds, their bodies covered in bruises and infections. Yet what struck her most wasn't the physical damage, it was the fear. They refused to undress, refused to eat, refused even to lie down. Every act of kindness triggered panic. Morrison realized standard procedure wouldn't work, so she broke protocol. She requested only female staff in the ward, removed uniforms, and allowed the women to decide when and how they were treated. Every action needed permission, even a simple touch. "Don't command," she told her medics. "Ask." Slowly, small changes began to appear. One woman accepted water. Another allowed her wounds to be cleaned. Kim Sunhi remained silent through it all, until a nurse offered her a mirror. She turned her face away at first, then glanced back. The reflection shocked her. She hadn't seen her own face in years. She began to weep, her body shaking with something between grief and rediscovery. The medical team quickly learned that language wasn't their only barrier. Trust was. The women had been trained to associate soldiers with cruelty, orders with pain. So Morrison and her team began introducing gentle rituals, soft music from a field radio, shared meals, time alone. One day, an interpreter arrived. Sergeant Grace Kimura, a Japanese American from Hawaii. The moment she spoke Japanese, panic erupted. The women screamed, scrambling for the corners of the room. Morrison stepped between them, shouting, "She's here to help." But fear didn't listen to translation. Kimura hesitated, then switched to Korean, words she had learned from her grandmother. The effect was instant. The women froze. The sound of their own language broke through years of conditioning. "I'm not from Japan," Kimura said gently. "I'm from Hawaii. You're safe now." For the first time, Kim Sunhi looked up, truly looked. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered in broken Korean, "Hawaii, far away." Kimura smiled faintly. "Far away," she repeated, "but here with you." In that moment, the women began to trust again. The first fragile bridge between two worlds, one of war, one of healing, had been built not by medicine, but by empathy. Days turned into weeks. The compound transformed from a place of fear into a fragile sanctuary. Under Captain Morrison's supervision, the Army developed new protocols, not for combat recovery, but for emotional survival. Meals were restructured into smaller, frequent portions to rebuild strength. The women were never forced to eat. Instead, food was offered with patience. Slowly, the sound of spoons against metal bowls began to replace silence. Morrison wrote in her journal, "Every bite is a declaration of life." Sergeant Grace Kimura became the heart of communication. Her gentle Korean, mixed with laughter and occasional mistakes, brought the women comfort. Through her, the medics learned that most survivors had forgotten their own languages. Fear had stripped even words away, so they began cultural restoration, teaching the women traditional songs, writing familiar phrases on scraps of paper, cooking rice the way their mothers once did. For Kim Sunhi, the transformation came one quiet morning. She sat outside the hut, sunlight brushing her face, and watched American nurses hang freshly washed clothes. When one offered her soap, Kim hesitated. The nurse smiled, placed it in her hands, and walked away, leaving her alone. For the first time in years, Kim bathed in privacy. The water was cold, the soap rough, but as she washed, she felt something return. Dignity. She whispered, "Clean, again." Morrison observed quietly from a distance. She knew what that moment meant. Freedom wasn't just about opening a door. It was about restoring choice, privacy, silence, control over one's own body. These were the real symbols of liberation. As the women healed physically, their strength returned in other ways. They began to talk, to sing, to care for one another again. Within the huts, older women shared stories of survival, how they had hidden food, protected the younger ones, whispered lullabies in the dark. "We became sisters in suffering," one of them said. "That is why we lived." Those words spread through the camp like warmth. What had once been a network of pain became a network of resilience. When medics asked how they survived, Kim Sunhi answered softly, "Because we held each other. When one wanted to die, another said no." By the end of the month, the women began assisting the nurses, folding bandages, cleaning, and even comforting wounded soldiers who came through. The same hands that had endured brutality were now healing others. The war had taken their voices. Now, through compassion, they were reclaiming them, one gentle act at a time. By the summer of 1945, peace had officially returned to the Pacific. But for the survivors in that small compound, peace wasn't a ceremony, it was a slow awakening. Each woman carried memories that refused to fade, scars that whispered even in silence. Yet among them grew something powerful, the will to live on their own terms. When the U.S. Army began repatriation efforts, many of the women hesitated. Home no longer felt like a promise. For some, it was a place of shame. Society would not understand what they had endured. A few chose to stay in the Philippines, joining local aid efforts. Others boarded ships for Korea, China, and beyond, clutching blankets and prayer beads, fragments of the lives they hoped to rebuild. Captain Helen Morrison wrote her final report before leaving the islands. In the margins, she added a personal note. They were not just victims. They were survivors who taught us what healing really means. Her experience reshaped military medicine itself. trauma care would never again ignore the soul. Sergeant Grace Kimura continued to serve as an interpreter for repatriation missions. Years later, she would tell her children, "The bravest thing I ever saw wasn't a soldier charging a hill. It was a woman learning to trust the world again." As the decades passed, testimonies from these survivors began to surface. Some chose silence, a dignified decision in itself. Others became voices for truth, telling their stories to historians, courts, and generations who needed to know. Kim Sunhi, now an elderly woman, once spoke at a small community gathering in Busan. She said quietly, "I used to think my survival was luck. Now, I know it was strength. Our pain became our proof that even when the world forgets, we endure." Her words rippled across time, shaping conversations about human rights and wartime accountability. What began as hidden suffering became a cornerstone of international law, the idea that dignity must be protected even in war. In her final years, Kim lived a quiet life by the sea. Each morning, she watched the tide roll in and whispered prayers for those who never made it home. The waves carried her memories, not as sorrow, but as remembrance. History remembers battles by their victories, but some victories are invisible, found in the quiet courage of those who choose to heal. Kim Sunhi's story stands as a reminder: liberation is not the end of struggle. It is the beginning of becoming whole again. Their survival became their resistance, their healing, their triumph.